In 1939, the Philippine Islands were home to nearly 5,000 American citizens. At the U.S. Army post, where Robert T. Browne worked as a purchasing agent for the Quartermaster Depot, the top brass lived lives of colonial splendor. Even General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Commander MacArthur's hard-working assistant, left his office at noon for a long lunch and a midday siesta. The afternoons were reserved for bridge. Parties and social events filled the evenings. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese bombed the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. Even so, most Americans in the Philippines did not believe the Japanese would invade Manila. U.S. Army Commander General Douglas MacArthur further bolstered this false sense of confidence by announcing that the situation in the Philippines was under control. But as MacArthur well knew, the American troops in the Philippines were severely undersupplied. Robert T. Browne, like the rest of the purchasing agents that worked for the Quartermaster Depot, was told to acquire the supplies he needed by any means necessary. As 1941 came to an end, he would have been working around the clock. Eventually, rather than risk a brutal and bloody battle on the streets of Manila, MacArthur opted to retreat with his army to Corregidor, a rocky stronghold he believed would be impenetrable by the Japanese. On January 2, 1942, the Japanese army marched into Manila. Four days after the Japanese invaded Manila, all foreign nationals were ordered to report to Santo Tomas University. Robert T. Browne and the other terrified civilians were told to bring only 3 days' worth of food and clothing with them. But as the days stretched into weeks and then months, the internees constructed shanties to relieve the overcrowded conditions inside the main building. Soon, the different clusters of huts grew into separate neighborhoods, each with its own colorful name: Garden Court, Shantytown, or Froggy Bottom. Robert T. Browne would later tell Louis Lomax of the Washington Post that, quote, the Japanese insisted that there be no discrimination or segregation within the camp. The guards would come around and ask the colored men if the American whites with whom they shared rooms were molesting them. Occasionally, fights broke out between the young white and colored men, Browne continued, because the latter refused to accept the derogatory names the whites called them. But these situations were soon quieted. The removal of the barriers that usually separated the races made it easier for whites and blacks to meet each other. In Santo Tomas, Robert T. Browne would meet 2 white people who would change his life forever. Edgar Mason Needler was born in Manila amid wealth and privilege. His father, an American doctor who had moved to Manila after the Spanish-American War, was a shrewd investor whose real estate holdings included an office building, 2 hotels, and an apartment complex. After graduating from the University of California at Berkeley, Edgar married his college sweetheart and returned to Manila to manage his father's hotel. Inside the camp, everyone was assigned a job. Some people cooked, some washed clothes. And teachers, those who were qualified, offered classes to their fellow internees. Among these classes were lectures on Oriental philosophy and esoteric Christianity, given by Robert T. Browne. Edgar Needler attended Browne's lectures regularly. Sometime in the year that followed, Cecilia Weiss Martin also joined the group. Born to Jewish immigrants in Chicago in 1899, Cecilia traveled back and forth to Europe several times as a young girl. After a brief marriage to a Venezuelan dentist in 1922, she worked as a Spanish teacher in New York City before setting off for the Far East. While in the Philippines, she met and married Frederick Martin, a wealthy British landowner who was 30 years her senior. When she saw Robert T. Browne giving a lecture at Santo Tomas, Cecilia perceived psychically that Browne was a spiritually advanced being. After class, Robert T. Browne begged her not to tell anyone what she had seen. When Cecilia said that she hoped to travel to India in search of a guru, Robert T. Browne told her the trip would not be necessary. "You have found the master you are looking for," he said. By 1943, conditions inside the Santo Tomas internment camp had become desperate. Dependent on the food provided by their Japanese captors, malnutrition soon became a way of life for the residents of Santo Tomas. Robert T. Browne's daily ration would have consisted of 2 scoops of a thin gruel made from rice and cornmeal, with the occasional microscopic piece of meat or vegetable thrown in. To help his fellow internees survive, Browne began to share the mind-over-matter principles he'd acquired over decades of spiritual study. "Imagine you're biting into an orange," he told them. "Savor its flavor and imagine the juice running down your chin." According to historian Christopher Paul Moore, Browne's visualization technique became a, quote, camp phenomenon. To relieve the overcrowded conditions at Santo Tomas, the Japanese opened a new facility on the campus of Los Baños Agricultural College in May of 1943. Named for its healing mineral baths, the town was located on the shores of a large island lake 40 miles south of Manila. By mid-December of 1944, Los Baños was home to 2,100 foreign nationals. Among them was Robert T. Browne. The Japanese second in command at Los Baños, Officer Konishi, took a particular dislike to the Westerners interned there. When a delivery of much-needed meat arrived a few hours late, Konishi sent it back unopened. On another memorable occasion, he dumped an entire wagon load of fresh fruit onto the ground. For hours, he forced the starving internees to watch as the food rotted in the hot tropical sun. Finally, at the end of the day, Konishi permitted the internees to scavenge among the stinking, fly-covered remains like animals. This was the darkest hour of the entire period of our internment, Robert T. Browne would tell an interviewer after the war. We had reached the depths of desolation. On February 3, 1945, American troops returned to Manila to rescue the internees who had stayed behind at Santo Tomas. As an American flag was hung from the balcony of the main building, the tearful crowd shouted until they were hoarse. Their 3 years of suffering and starvation had finally come to an end. At Los Baños, the situation for Robert T. Browne and the other prisoners had become critical. The camp rice supply will be gone by Monday, a Los Baños internee noted in her diary. I weigh 83 pounds. Another man died this morning, 2 yesterday. One went completely off his nut and began to chew on his trousers and belt. I heard he finished his trousers. The grave diggers work overtime. Rescue must come soon. It was at this point that some people believe Robert T. Browne sent an angel to whisper a message in General MacArthur's ear. Whatever the reason, in spite of the many other operations competing for his attention and resources, MacArthur decided to send a company of American paratroopers to Los Baños. At dawn on the 23rd of February, 1945, 110 American paratroopers burst through the gates at Los Baños. A terrific battle ensued between the paratroopers and the Japanese guards, Robert T. Browne told an interviewer after the war, while an American plane flew overhead bearing in large letters, "Rescue," thereby informing us what the battle was all about. As the battle raged around them, the internees were told to lie on the ground. Most of the prisoners were filled with terror, Browne recalled. When we were permitted to stand up, bodies of dead men lay strewn all about us. After the war, Robert T. Browne had nothing but praise for MacArthur and his troops. It was, in my opinion, one of the most remarkable exploits to rescue prisoners of war in military history, he recalled. No wonder General MacArthur said, "God was certainly with us today." At the end of the war, Cecilia Weiss and her husband, the British landowner Frederick Martin, returned to Manila to search for the rest of his family. It must have been a searing experience. 200,000 civilians lost their lives in the battle to retake Manila, and much of the city had been bombed to rubble. When the couple returned to his home in the Spanish colonial section of the city, they found his 13-year-old daughter Luz hiding among the ruins. The other 11 members of her family had been killed in the fighting. When Cecilia and Frederick separated later that year, she brought Luz Martin to New York to live with her. After Cecilia and Robert T. Browne were married in 1947, Browne adopted the girl, renaming her Yotisha in honor of the ancient Hindu science of astrology and divination. Here she is in 1955, winning third place in a beauty contest sponsored by Harlem's Abyssinian Baptist Church. In the summer of 1946, Robert T. Browne was 64 years old. Most men his age would have been ready for a peaceful retirement, long naps, or idle afternoons curled up with a good book. But Robert Tecumseh Browne was not like most men his age. After returning from the war, he would embark on the most ambitious phase of his long life. In the next episode, we'll take a look at Browne's work as a spiritual teacher and religious leader.